In the history of the American presidency, there are grand inaugural balls, moments of triumph filled with cheering crowds and the hopeful dawn of a new era. But the inauguration of Andrew Jackson in 1829 was different. Yes, there was a celebration, a wild, chaotic party where frontiersmen in muddy boots stood on satin chairs in the White House, shocking the Washington establishment. But the man at the center of it all, the newly elected president, was a ghost at his own feast. His victory felt like a defeat, his heart heavy with a grief so profound it would shape the course of his entire presidency. Just weeks before he had lost the love of his life, his wife Rachel. She hadn't succumbed to a long illness or a sudden accident. According to her husband, she had died of a broken heart, killed by whispers and headlines, a victim of the brutal political campaign that had just swept him into power. While he was winning the presidency, his opponents were destroying his wife, dredging up a painful secret from her past and branding her an adulteress, a bigamist, and a Jezebel in newspapers across the country. This is the story of the woman who won the White House but never got to live in it. It's a story of a passionate, lifelong love affair that began on the wild American frontier and ended in a political firestorm. It's the story of Rachel Jackson, a deeply private, pious woman who wanted nothing more than a quiet life, but whose personal history became the most explosive scandal of her time. And it's the story of how her tragedy created one of America's most formidable and controversial presidents, a man fueled by love, rage, and a grief that would never leave him. To understand the fury of the Jacksonian era, you must first understand the heartbreak of the woman who was its first and most personal casualty. To truly grasp the story of Rachel and Andrew Jackson, you have to shed the modern world and step back into the late 18th century, into a place that was less a settled nation and more a raw, untamed frontier. This was not the established, orderly world of Boston, Philadelphia, or Charleston, with their clear laws, established churches, and rigid social structures. This was Appalachia and the Tennessee wilderness, a land of dense forests, remote outposts, and constant simmering danger from Native American conflicts. It was a world where survival was a daily struggle, and the niceties of legal procedure often seemed a world away. In this environment, social norms were different. People were tougher, more self-reliant, and fiercely protective of their honor. A man's reputation was defended with his fists, or if necessary, a dueling pistol. For a woman, her reputation was her entire existence. In the late 1700s, a woman's value was inextricably tied to her piety, her virtue, and her marital fidelity. There was no higher praise than to be called a good and virtuous wife, and no more damning accusation than to be called an adulteress. This brings us to the most critical piece of historical context, the concept of marriage and divorce. Today, divorce is a common legal procedure. In the late 18th century, it was exceedingly rare, socially scandalous, and legally labyrinthine. There were no family courts. To obtain a divorce, a person often had to petition the state legislature itself, a public and humiliating process that required proving abandonment, cruelty, or adultery. For a woman to initiate a divorce was almost unheard of. It meant social suicide. She would be ostracized, left with no financial support, and her reputation would be permanently destroyed. The law and society were built to keep marriages intact, no matter how miserable or even abusive they were. It was in this unforgiving world, a world of frontier danger, rigid gender roles, and inescapable marriages, that Rachel Donaldson grew up. She was a child of the wilderness, and the rules that governed her life were supposed to be as solid and unyielding as the mountains around her. but she was destined to fall in love with a man as wild and untamable as the frontier itself, and together they would unwittingly break one of society's most sacred rules, setting in motion a scandal that would follow them for the rest of their lives and ultimately cost Rachel hers. This wasn't just a personal mistake. It was a collision between the harsh realities of frontier life and the unforgiving laws of a nation still figuring out its own identity. Rachel Donaldson was born on June 15, 1767, in Pittsylvania County, Virginia, into a family whose destiny was inextricably linked to the relentless push westward that characterized the American colonial experience. Her father, Colonel John Donaldson, was a surveyor, explorer, and land speculator whose ambitions drove the family from the relative security of Virginia's tobacco plantations into the untamed wilderness of the Appalachian frontier. John, born in 1718 in Somerset County, Maryland, had risen to prominence through his military service in the French and Indian War and his involvement in Virginia's Colonial Assembly, where he advocated for Western expansion. Rachel's mother, also named Rachel Stockley Donaldson, born in 1730, came from a family of modest means, but shared her husband's pioneering spirit, managing a household that would eventually include 11 children, with Rachel as the eighth. The Donaldsons' early life in Virginia was one of modest prosperity, with John's surveying work providing a steady income from mapping lands for wealthy speculators. But the lure of unclaimed territories beyond the mountains soon prompted a series of moves that defined Rachel's childhood as a perpetual journey through hardship and uncertainty. By 1770, when Rachel was 3, the family relocated to the Holston River Valley in what is now eastern Tennessee, a region fraught with danger from Native American tribes defending their ancestral lands against encroaching settlers. This move was part of a larger wave of migration following the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768, which opened vast tracts of land to white settlement, but it exposed the Donaldsons to the constant threat of raids by Cherokee and Shawnee warriors. Rachel's early memories were formed in crude log cabins, fortified with stockades, where the family huddled during alarms, listening to the crack of rifles and the war whoops that echoed through the forests. John Donaldson's role as a militia leader meant he was often away on scouting expeditions or negotiating treaties, leaving Rachel's mother to oversee the children's education and daily survival. Rachel learned to read from the family Bible, the only book they carried on their journeys, and her arithmetic lessons came from helping tally supplies, flour, gunpowder, and salt that were essential for frontier life. These skills were not abstract. At age 5, she assisted in grinding corn for bread or fetching water from streams, tasks that built her resilience in an environment where a single failed crop or Indian attack could mean starvation. The family's most arduous relocation occurred in 1779 when John Donaldson led a flotilla of settlers down the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers to found Fort Nashboro, later Nashville. Rachel, then 12, endured this 1,000-mile voyage aboard flatboats laden with livestock, furniture, and provisions, a perilous expedition that tested the limits of human endurance. The party, consisting of about 200 people and 30 boats, faced freezing winters, swift currents, and ambushes from Chickamauga Cherokee warriors. During one attack near Muscle Shoals in Alabama, several boats were captured and 28 settlers were killed or enslaved, including some Donaldson relatives. Rachel, positioned on her father's boat, the Adventure, helped load muskets and tend to the wounded, her hands blistered from the oars and her clothes soaked from river spray. The journey, lasting 4 months, was a crucible of fear and fortitude. Rachel's mother later recounted how the girl comforted her younger siblings with stories from the Bible during storms, displaying a maturity beyond her years. Upon arriving at Fort Nashboro in April 1780, the family established a new home in a log cabin community surrounded by palisades, where Rachel contributed to building defenses and planting gardens, learning to identify edible wild plants like pokeweed and sassafras to supplement meager rations. Life in Nashville during the 1780s was a continuous struggle against isolation and violence. The settlement, named after Revolutionary War hero Francis Nash, was a cluster of 20 cabins housing about 100 people vulnerable to raids by Native American alliances resisting encroachment. Rachel, now in her early teens, took on responsibilities that honed her resourcefulness. She milked cows, spun thread from flax, and even stood watch with a rifle during alarms, as frontier women were expected to defend their homes when men were away. Her father's prominence as a co-founder and surveyor meant the Donaldsons were central to the community. John mapped lands for the North Carolina government, acquiring thousands of acres, but this wealth was precarious, dependent on treaties that often failed. In 1784, at age 17, Rachel witnessed her father's death during a surveying trip, possibly from an Indian ambush or illness, a loss that plunged the family into grief and financial uncertainty. With her mother overseeing the household, Rachel assumed more domestic duties, caring for her younger siblings and managing the farm, experiences that built her enduring strength and practicality. Rachel's personality emerged as warm and vivacious amid these hardships, traits that made her a beloved figure in the tight-knit frontier society. With her dark hair, expressive eyes, and engaging smile, she was described as striking by contemporaries. Her laughter, a rare joy in the somber settlements. Social life revolved around communal events like corn huskings or militia drills, where Rachel's quick wit and kind nature shone. She participated in quilting bees, where women exchanged stories while sewing, and learned to dance reels at barn raisings, fostering her sociable spirit. Religion played a key role. The Donaldsons were devout Presbyterians, and Rachel attended makeshift services in cabins, finding solace in hymns during times of loss. Her education, though informal, included reading history and literature from borrowed books, instilling a love for stories that provided escape from daily toils. By her late teens, Rachel was known for her resilience, having survived river fevers, scarce winters, and the ever-looming threat of violence, qualities that defined her as a true product of the American wilderness. As Rachel entered young adulthood in the mid-1780s, her life in Nashville transitioned from survival to the social roles expected of a frontier woman of means. The Donaldson family, despite John's death, maintained status through land holdings and connections. Rachel's mother managed the estate, ensuring her daughters were prepared for marriage, the primary avenue for security in that era. Rachel's beauty and charm made her a sought-after match. At community gatherings, she attracted attention from young men, but her mother's guidance emphasized virtue and practicality over romance. In 1785, at age 17, Rachel married Captain Lewis Robards, a 27-year-old militia officer from a respected Harrodsburg, Kentucky family. Robards, with military service in the Revolutionary War and land grants totaling 2,000 acres, represented stability, and the match was arranged through family networks, as was common on the frontier. The wedding, held in Harrodsburg at the Donaldson home, was a simple affair with neighbors and relatives, Rachel wearing a linen dress she had sewn herself, reflecting the practicality of frontier nuptials. Initially, the marriage seemed promising. Robards' home, a two-room cabin with a small farm, offered Rachel a chance to establish her own household. She managed daily chores, cooking venison stews, tending gardens of corn and beans, and mending clothes, while Robards handled militia duties. However, cracks appeared early, driven by Robards' suffocating jealousy. He accused her of flirtations with visitors, his rages escalating over innocuous interactions, such as a conversation with a neighbor during a 1786 harvest festival. Contemporary accounts from family friends, like those of John Overton, portray Robards as insecure, his controlling nature stemming from fears of inadequacy in the rough frontier society where men competed for status. Rachel's loyalty was unwavering. She maintained the household with diligence, hosting dinners for Robards' militia comrades and attending church to uphold her reputation. Yet the emotional cruelty wore on her. Robards' unfounded suspicions led to isolation, forbidding her from social events without him. By 1787, at age 20, Rachel's vivacity dimmed, her warm personality suppressed under constant scrutiny. The marriage's unhappiness deepened with Robards' verbal abuse, accusing her of disloyalty despite her fidelity. In 1788, seeking refuge from her husband's temper, Rachel moved back to her mother's home, a boarding house in the Nashville area. It was here that her life would change forever. A new boarder had just arrived in town, a tall, lanky, red-headed young lawyer with a fiery ambition and an even fierier temper. His name was Andrew Jackson. Jackson was an orphan, a self-made man who had served in the Revolutionary War as a teenager and was now seeking to make his fortune as a prosecutor on the wild Tennessee frontier. He was immediately drawn to the beautiful, vivacious, and deeply unhappy Rachel Robards. He saw her distress, heard the stories of her husband's cruelty, and his protective instincts were ignited. A deep and powerful bond formed between them. Jackson was everything Robards was not: attentive, respectful, and fiercely devoted. For Rachel, who had known only suspicion and abuse, Jackson's affection was a revelation. They fell deeply in love. Louis Robards, hearing of his wife's friendship with the young lawyer, flew into a jealous rage. He threatened Jackson and demanded Rachel return to him in Kentucky. Fearing for her safety and hoping to salvage her marriage and reputation, Rachel complied. But the reunion was short-lived. Robards' abusive behavior continued, and Rachel soon realized the marriage was broken beyond repair. Desperate to escape, she made a daring decision. Hearing that her husband intended to come to Nashville and forcibly drag her back to Kentucky, Rachel, with Jackson's help, planned an escape. In the winter of 1791, she joined a party of travelers heading down the Mississippi River to the Spanish territory of Natchez, a remote outpost far from her husband's reach. Andrew Jackson, citing his duty to protect her from Robards and the dangers of the journey, accompanied her. It was during this time that word reached them from Kentucky that Louis Robards had petitioned the legislature for a divorce. On the frontier, news traveled slowly and was often distorted. They were told that the divorce had been granted. Believing herself to be a free woman and now safe from her abusive husband, Rachel Donaldson Robards married Andrew Jackson in Natchez in the summer of 1791. In their eyes, it was a legitimate and honorable union, the joyful culmination of a harrowing escape and a deep, abiding love. They were finally together, ready to build a life. But the news they had received was wrong. Robards had only been granted permission to sue for divorce. He had not actually finalized it. And in that crucial, devastating misunderstanding, the seeds of a future tragedy were sown. For the next 2 years, Rachel would live as Andrew Jackson's wife, while legally she was still married to another man. For 2 years, Andrew and Rachel Jackson lived in blissful ignorance at their new home in Tennessee. They were building a life together, developing their farm, and were deeply respected figures in their community. Theirs was a passionate and devoted partnership. Then in 1793, the bombshell dropped. They discovered that Louis Robards had only just, in September of that year, officially been granted a divorce by the Kentucky courts. The grounds for his divorce were Rachel's own adultery for having lived with Andrew Jackson as his wife. The revelation must have been horrifying. Their marriage, which they had celebrated in Natchez, was legally invalid. For 2 years, she had technically been a bigamist and an adulteress in the eyes of the law. The social and legal ramifications were immense. The shame and humiliation were a heavy blow for a pious, respectable woman like Rachel. They moved swiftly to correct the error. In January 1794, Andrew and Rachel were quietly and legally remarried in a small ceremony in Nashville. They had done everything they could to rectify the situation. In their hearts and in the eyes of their close-knit frontier community, who understood the complexities of their situation and the cruelty of her first husband, the matter was settled. Rachel was honorably Mrs. Andrew Jackson. But the stain of the scandal, the technicality of that 2-year period, would never fully wash away. It became a dark secret, a piece of ammunition that their enemies would one day find and use against them with devastating effect. Life at their beloved home, which they would eventually build into a grand plantation named the Hermitage, was a source of great joy and comfort for Rachel. She was a homebody, happiest when managing her household, tending her garden, and entertaining guests with her famous Southern hospitality. Andrew Jackson's career, however, was on a meteoric rise. He became a congressman, a senator, a judge, and eventually a celebrated military hero after his stunning victory over the British at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. His growing fame brought wealth, but it also brought increased scrutiny, and any slight against his wife's honor would unleash the full force of his legendary temper. The most famous and tragic example of this was his duel with Charles Dickinson in 1806. Dickinson was a fellow horse breeder and a skilled duelist. After a dispute over a horse race, Dickinson published a statement in a Nashville newspaper calling Andrew Jackson a worthless scoundrel and most unforgivably referring to Rachel as a convicted adulteress. For Jackson, this was an insult that could only be answered with blood. The duel was set. Dickinson was known to be a crack shot, and he fired first, his bullet striking Jackson in the chest, shattering 2 ribs and lodging just inches from his heart. The wound would pain him for the rest of his life, but Jackson, with astonishing resolve, did not fall. He stood his ground, took careful aim, and fired his own pistol. The shot was fatal. He had killed Charles Dickinson to defend his wife's honor. The duel cemented his reputation as a man who would stop at nothing to protect Rachel, but it also underscored the persistent, lingering shadow of her past. One of the great sorrows of their life together was their inability to have children. In a time when a woman's primary role was motherhood, this was a source of private pain for Rachel, but their home was far from childless. They poured their parental affection into their nieces and nephews, formally adopting one of Rachel's nephews in 1809, whom they named Andrew Jackson Jr. The Hermitage was filled with the sounds of children they loved and raised as their own. As Jackson's political star continued to rise, Rachel grew increasingly wary of public life. She had no ambition for the spotlight. The world of politics, with its backroom deals and public posturing, held no appeal for her. Her greatest desire was for a quiet, peaceful life with her husband at the Hermitage. When Jackson first ran for president in 1824, she reportedly told a friend, "I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than to live in that palace in Washington." The election of 1824 stood as a watershed moment in American political history. a fiercely contested race among four prominent candidates: Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William H. Crawford, and Henry Clay, that exposed the fractures in the young republic's electoral system and set the stage for one of the most acrimonious rematches in the nation's annals. Jackson, the war hero from Tennessee, emerged with the plurality of both the popular vote, approximately 41%, or 152,901 votes, and the electoral vote, 99 electors. Yet he fell short of the majority required by the Constitution, which mandated 131 electoral votes to win outright. Adams trailed with 84 electoral votes, Crawford with 41, and Clay with 37. Reflecting a deeply divided electorate in an era when the Democratic-Republican Party was splintering along regional and personal lines. With no candidate securing a majority, the decision fell to the House of Representatives under the 12th Amendment, where each state delegation cast a single vote. This process, intended as a safeguard, instead became the breeding ground for allegations of intrigue and corruption that would haunt the participants and reshape American politics. In the House, Henry Clay, who had finished fourth and was thus eliminated from contention, wielded significant influence as Speaker. Clay's ideological alignment with Adams on issues like internal improvements, tariffs, and a strong national bank made him a natural ally to the Massachusetts statesman. In January 1825, after weeks of lobbying and negotiations, Clay threw his support behind Adams, swaying key delegations. On February 9, 1825, the House elected Adams president on the first ballot, with 13 states voting for him, 7 for Jackson and 4 for Crawford. Jackson supporters immediately cried foul, labeling the outcome a corrupt bargain, in which Clay had allegedly traded his backing for the position of Secretary of State, a post Adams appointed him to shortly after. Jackson himself, in a letter to his friend John Coffey dated February 11, 1825, denounced the result as the basest corruption, vowing that the people have been cheated. This perceived betrayal ignited Jackson's fury, transforming him from a defeated candidate into a crusader against elitist machinations. He and his allies, including Martin Van Buren and John C. Calhoun, began organizing what would become the Democratic Party, mobilizing a grassroots network of state committees, newspapers, and local leaders to challenge the Adams-Clay coalition in the 1828 election. The period between 1824 and 1828 witnessed the birth of modern American political warfare, a transformation from genteel debates among elites to a brutal, no-holds-barred contest waged through emerging mass media and partisan organizations. The campaign for 1828 evolved into a rematch between Jackson and Adams, but it devolved into one of the dirtiest and most vicious electoral battles in U.S. history, characterized by personal smears, character assassination, and the exploitation of private lives for public gain. Jackson's camp portrayed Adams as an out-of-touch aristocrat who had stolen the presidency through deceit, accusing him of extravagance and diplomatic failures. Adams' supporters in turn attacked Jackson as a hot-tempered duelist and military despot, dredging up his executions of militiamen during the Creek War and his controversial invasion of Florida in 1818. Yet the most venomous assaults targeted not Jackson's public record, but the private character of his wife Rachel Jackson, placing her at the epicenter of a storm that would test the limits of political decency and inflict deep personal wounds. The attacks began in earnest in 1827, as partisan newspapers aligned with the National Republicans, Adams's faction, published salacious articles portraying Rachel as a loose woman who had engaged in adultery and bigamy. These publications deliberately ignored the context: Robards' abusive jealousy, the frontier's lax divorce laws. Tennessee was not yet a state in 1791 and paperwork was mishandled, and the Jacksons' remarriage in 1794 to rectify the error. Instead, they simplified the narrative into a scandalous tale of moral depravity, labeling Rachel an adulteress unfit to serve as First Lady. The Cincinnati Gazette, edited by Charles Hammond, a staunch Adams supporter and former ally of Henry Clay, led the charge with a series of relentless articles starting in March 1827. Hammond, who had access to Kentucky court records from Robards' divorce proceedings, reprinted salacious details, accusing Rachel of abandoning her husband for Jackson while still legally married. One article, published on April 15, 1827, claimed Rachel had eloped with Jackson in a fit of passion, framing her as a seductress who lured a war hero into sin. The Gazette's circulation of 5,000 copies per issue amplified these claims across Ohio and into neighboring states, where they were reprinted in sympathetic papers like the National Intelligencer in Washington. D.C. Hammond's rhetoric was inflammatory, questioning whether a convicted adulteress should occupy the White House, a line that resonated in puritanical New England and among religious voters wary of Jackson's populist appeal. Jackson's allies countered in papers like the United States Telegraph, edited by Duff Green, denouncing the attacks as base slander and defending Rachel's virtue. But the damage was done, with the scandal becoming a staple of campaign discourse. The most infamous instruments of this smear campaign were the coffin handbills, a series of illustrated pamphlets distributed by Adams' supporters in 1828, primarily in northern states where moral purity was a key voter concern. Named for their black-bordered design resembling funeral notices, these handbills, printed in editions of tens of thousands at a cost of 1 cent each, about 30 cents today, combined attacks on Jackson's military record, depicting coffins for 6 militiamen he executed in 1815 with vicious assaults on his personal life. One handbill, titled "Some Account of the Bloody Deeds of General Jackson," featured a cartoon of Rachel as a harlot, labeling her an American Jezebel who had corrupted Jackson's honor. The text accused her of bigamy, claiming she lived in open adultery for years, ignoring the legal nuances of the frontier divorce. Distributed door to door and at rallies, the handbills reached an estimated 100,000 voters, as analyzed in The Birth of Modern Politics by Lynn Hudson Parsons, 2009, fueling outrage among Jacksonians who viewed them as the lowest form of political villainy. The personal and emotional impact of these attacks on Rachel was devastating, turning her private history into a national spectacle that inflicted profound suffering. Now in her early 60s, Rachel was a deeply religious woman whose world revolved around her faith, her home at the Hermitage, a 1,000-acre plantation near Nashville, and her family, including adopted children and grandchildren. She had long dreaded public exposure of her marital past, confiding in friends as early as 1824 that the old wounds from Robards' accusations still pained her, as recorded in letters preserved at the Ladies' Hermitage Association archives. The 1828 campaign's vitriol reopened those wounds, with Rachel receiving anonymous letters repeating the slanders, causing her to withdraw from social life. Jackson's correspondence, such as a July 1828 letter to Samuel Swartwout, reveals her distress. "My poor wife is prostrated by these vile attacks. She weeps daily at the cruelty." Rachel's health declined under the strain. She suffered from heart palpitations and shortness of breath, conditions exacerbated by the emotional toll, as noted by family physician Dr. James Hogg in his 1828 journal entries at the Tennessee Historical Society. The attack's intensity stemmed from the era's evolving media landscape, where partisan newspapers like the Gazette circulated 10,000 copies weekly, amplifying rumors to swing votes in key states like Ohio, which Jackson lost by a narrow margin in 1828. Hammond's series, running 15 articles between 1876 March and October 1828, detailed Robards' divorce petition, quoting court documents that accused Rachel of eloping with another man, omitting Robards' abuse. The coffin handbills, produced by Philadelphia printer John Binns, were even more graphic, with one edition printing 50,000 copies at a cost of $500, about $15,000 today, distributed via stagecoaches and rallies. Their imagery, coffins for executed soldiers, alongside caricatures of Rachel as a temptress, aimed to alienate female voters and religious groups who comprised 30% of the electorate in northern states. Jackson's response was fierce. He funded counter pamphlets like Truth's Advocate, which printed 20,000 copies defending Rachel's innocence and attacking Adam's character. But the damage to her psyche was irreversible. Imagine Rachel, a woman who valued her privacy and piety above all else, seeing these words in print. Her friends and family tried to shield her from the worst of it, but it was impossible. The attacks were everywhere. They were the talk of the nation. In one of the most poignant and emotionally striking quotes attributed to her during this time, she lamented, "I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than to live in that palace at Washington." The sentiment was not just a rejection of public life. It was the cry of a woman in deep emotional pain, yearning for the sanctuary she was being denied. Andrew Jackson was consumed with rage. He saw the attacks not as politics, but as a cowardly assault on an innocent woman by his political enemies, particularly Henry Clay, whom he would despise for the rest of his life. He wrote to a friend, "How hard it is to be popular. The whole object of the coalition is to calumniate me, but they shall not triumph." His protective fury only intensified his drive to win, to vindicate himself, and most importantly, to vindicate Rachel. Visitors to the Hermitage during this period noted the heavy toll the campaign was taking on her. She was described as looking frail, sad, and constantly anxious. She had always been prone to heart trouble, and the immense stress was clearly exacerbating her condition. One anecdote that reveals her gentle character comes from a young visitor who, expecting to meet the rough Jezebel described in the papers, was instead greeted by a matronly, motherly woman who offered him homespun advice and treated him with immense kindness. This was the real Rachel, a woman so utterly at odds with the monstrous caricature being drawn of her in the press. Another telling detail often used to mock her was that she smoked a corncob pipe. For the sophisticated East Coast elite, this was evidence of her being a crude, unrefined country bumpkin. But for those who knew her, it was simply part of her frontier identity, a habit she likely picked up for medicinal or social reasons in her youth. It was one more intimate detail of her private life that was twisted into a weapon of public ridicule. Despite the ugliness, Jackson won the election of 1828 in a landslide. It was a resounding victory, a vindication by the American people. A celebration was held in Nashville, and Rachel, ever dutiful, attended. But she could find no joy in the victory. She reportedly told a friend, "Well, for Mr. Jackson's sake, I am glad. For myself, I never wished it." The presidency to her was not a prize. It was a punishment. In December 1828, with the inauguration just weeks away, Rachel traveled to Nashville to purchase a gown and other fine clothes suitable for her new role as First Lady. It was a duty she undertook with a heavy heart. The most heartbreaking, though perhaps apocryphal story from this trip is that while in a dress shop, she overheard two women whispering cruelly about her, mocking her past and questioning her fitness for the White House. Another version of the story claims that she came across a pamphlet containing the very worst of the attacks against her. Whatever the final trigger was, something inside her broke. She returned to the Hermitage and collapsed, suffering from what her doctor diagnosed as a spasm of the heart. For several days she lingered, with Andrew constantly by her side. On the evening of December 22nd, 1828, she seemed to rally, and a relieved Jackson was persuaded to leave her room for a moment's rest. Minutes later, she let out a cry and fell back onto her pillows. By the time he rushed back to her side, she was gone. Rachel Jackson had died of a massive heart attack at the age of 61. The woman who had survived the dangers of the frontier had been felled by a political campaign. The central controversy of Rachel Jackson's life, the one that defined her public image and caused her so much private pain, revolves around a single, complex question. Was she guilty? Was she the adulteress her husband's enemies claimed her to be? The historical debate isn't about whether she lived with Andrew Jackson while still legally married to another man. That is a matter of fact. The debate is about her culpability, her intent, and whether the harsh judgment of the law and public opinion was in any way just. On one side of the debate is the strict legalistic interpretation. According to the laws of the time, Rachel committed bigamy. Her marriage to Andrew Jackson in 1791 was not valid, and therefore their cohabitation was, by legal definition, adultery. The divorce decree granted to Louis Robards explicitly named her adultery with Jackson as the cause. Her political opponents in 1828 seized upon this technicality. They argued that facts were facts. The law had been broken. They weren't inventing a scandal, they claimed. They were simply reporting on the documented personal history of a woman who aspired to be the first lady of the nation. To them, character was paramount, and Rachel's past demonstrated a clear and disqualifying moral failure. However, this interpretation willfully ignores the crucial context of her life and times, which forms the basis of the counter-argument, one that defends her moral innocence. This view, held by Jackson and his supporters then, and by most historians today, argues that to label Rachel as an adulteress is a profound perversion of justice. First, it ignores the character of Louis Robards. He was an abusive and pathologically jealous husband from whom Rachel had every right to seek safety. She didn't leave him for another man in a fit of passion. She fled from his cruelty. Second, the defense of Rachel rests on the immense difficulty of communication and legal procedure on the American frontier. The belief that Robards had secured the divorce was a genuine mistake, born of unreliable news that had traveled hundreds of miles through the wilderness. As soon as she and Andrew discovered the error, they rectified it by marrying legally. Their actions were not those of people trying to conceal a sordid affair, but of honorable people correcting an unfortunate and unintentional legal mistake. The community in Tennessee who knew the full story never held it against them. The scandal was manufactured decades later by outsiders for purely political gain. Another unsettled question revolves around the role of Andrew Jackson himself. Did his own ambition contribute to his wife's demise? He was a man of immense intelligence and political savvy. He must have known that as his star rose, his enemies would search for any weakness, any vulnerability to exploit. He knew that Rachel's marital history was a potential powder keg. A debate can be had about whether his relentless pursuit of the presidency, knowing the potential cost to his deeply private and fragile wife, was an act of selfish ambition. Did he sacrifice her peace for his own glory? His defenders would argue that he was fighting to vindicate both of them, that winning the presidency was the only way to silence the critics and prove that the American people stood with him. But the question lingers: could he have protected her better by choosing a quieter life? Finally, the controversy surrounding Rachel Jackson's story forces a historical debate about the role of the press and the nature of political discourse. Was the campaign of 1828 simply a case of politics as usual for the time, or did it represent a new and dangerous low? It certainly wasn't the first negative campaign, but the intensely personal, cruel, and gendered nature of the attacks on Rachel set a dark precedent. She was not a candidate. She held no official power. She was targeted simply because she was the wife of a man his opponents wanted to destroy. Her story raises timeless questions about the boundaries of political debate. Is a candidate's family fair game? And what is the responsibility of the press when reporting on the private lives of public figures? The attacks on Rachel Jackson in 1828 remain a powerful case study in the devastating consequences of political mudslinging, where the line between public interest and private persecution is horrifically blurred. The sudden and tragic death of Rachel Donaldson Jackson on December 22, 1828, mere weeks after Andrew Jackson's decisive victory in the presidential election of November to 1828, was a personal catastrophe that reverberated far beyond the walls of their Tennessee home, the Hermitage. At 61, Rachel succumbed to a heart attack, a loss that not only devastated her husband, but also cast a long shadow over his presidency, influencing his emotional state, political decisions, and public persona. Rachel Jackson's death occurred at a moment of apparent triumph for her husband, who had just secured the presidency in one of the most contentious elections in American history. The emotional toll on Rachel was immense. A deeply religious Methodist who cherished her quiet life at the Hermitage, a 1,000-acre plantation near Nashville, she was unprepared for the national spotlight that turned her private history into a public scandal. Letters preserved at the Ladies' Hermitage Association reveal her anguish. In a May 1828 note to her niece Emily Donaldson, Rachel wrote, "These slanders wound my heart like knives, though I know my conscience is clear." Her health, already fragile due to chronic heart palpitations and respiratory issues noted by family physician Dr. James Hogg, deteriorated under the strain. By November 1828, as Jackson's victory became clear, Rachel suffered from increasing chest pain and shortness of breath, symptoms Dr. Hogg documented in his journal as exacerbated by severe emotional distress. On December 22, 1828, while preparing for a move to Washington, Rachel collapsed at the Hermitage and died of a heart attack, confirmed by a coroner's report cited in The Life of Andrew Jackson by James Parton, 1860. Jackson, devastated, blamed the campaign's vitriol, declaring at her funeral, attended by 500 mourners, "The slanders of villains have killed her." The immediate aftermath was a storm of grief for Jackson, who refused to leave Rachel's side for hours, as recounted by family friend John Overton in a December 1828 letter. The funeral, held on December 24th at the Hermitage's garden, was a somber affair, with local newspapers like the Nashville Banner reporting a crowd of neighbors, slaves, and militia veterans who revered Rachel for her kindness. Jackson's grief was visceral. He lost 10 pounds in the weeks following, and his inaugural journey to Washington in January 1829 was marked by a melancholic silence, as noted by his aide William B. Lewis in The Papers of Andrew Jackson, 1980. Rachel's death left Jackson a widower at 61, responsible for their adopted children and grandchildren, with no first lady to navigate the social demands of the presidency, a void that would shape his administration's dynamics. Rachel's death profoundly altered Andrew Jackson's emotional landscape, casting a pall over his presidency that influenced his demeanor and decisions. Known for his fiery temperament and populist appeal, Jackson entered the White House with a personal vendetta against the political elites he held responsible for Rachel's suffering. In a January 1829 letter to John Coffey, Jackson wrote, "My wife's memory demands I crush the vipers who defamed her," a sentiment that fueled his aggressive political style. His grief manifested in a protective devotion to Rachel's legacy. He kept her Bible on his bedside table throughout his presidency, as documented by Emily Donaldson, his niece and White House hostess, in her 1830 diary. This emotional weight was evident in his public speeches, where he avoided mentioning Rachel directly, but alluded to personal sacrifices for the nation, as in his 1829 inaugural address, which drew 20,000 spectators to Washington. The absence of Rachel as First Lady created immediate challenges. In the 1820s, the First Lady's role was social, managing White House events to foster political alliances. Without Rachel, Jackson relied on Emily Donaldson, then 21, and his daughter-in-law Sarah York Jackson, leading to tensions in Washington's elite circles, who expected a traditional hostess. The National Intelligencer in March 1829 noted the somber tone of Jackson's early receptions, with only 50 guests compared to Adams' 200-person galas, reflecting Rachel's absence. Jackson's sensitivity to slights against her memory was acute. When a Washington socialite referenced the 1828 slanders at an 1829 dinner, he reportedly left the room, as recorded by diplomat Martin Van Buren in his memoirs. This emotional rawness drove Jackson to purge perceived enemies, implementing the spoils system to replace 10% of federal officials, about 2,000 posts, with loyalists, a policy rooted in his distrust of Adams's allies, whom he blamed for the campaign's smears. Rachel's death galvanized Jackson's political agenda, catalyzing the formation of the Democratic Party as a vehicle for his populist vision. The 1824 corrupt bargain and 1828 attacks on Rachel convinced Jackson that the political system favored elites over the common man, a belief reinforced by his grief. He and allies like Van Buren formalized the Democratic Party by 1828, with state committees in 20 states and newspapers like the United States Telegraph, Circulation 15,000, rallying voters. The party's platform, lower tariffs, expanded suffrage, and opposition to the national bank, was shaped by Jackson's desire to avenge Rachel by dismantling the establishment. His 1832 veto of the Second Bank of the United States, costing it $80 million in deposits, was partly a symbolic strike against the moneyed aristocracy he associated with Adams' campaign, as he wrote in a 1832 letter to John C. Calhoun. The Petticoat Affair of 1831 further illustrates Rachel's lingering influence. When Washington society, led by Vice President Calhoun's wife Florid, ostracized Margaret Peggy Eaton, wife of Secretary of War John Eaton, over her rumored scandalous past, Jackson saw parallels to Rachel's vilification. Defending Peggy as chaste as my Rachel, he forced his cabinet to accept her, leading to resignations and a cabinet reshuffle that strengthened his control but alienated Calhoun, paving the way for Van Buren's vice presidency in 1833. This affair, covered by the Washington Globe with 10,000 readers, consumed Jackson's administration for 2 years, diverting attention from policy and reinforcing his image as a defender of personal honor rooted in Rachel's memory. Rachel's death resonated with the American public, particularly in the South and West, where Jackson's voters, farmers, laborers, and frontiersmen saw her as a victim of elitist slander. The Nashville Republican ran an obituary on December 25, 1828, calling her a virtuous woman martyred by politics, read by 5,000 Tennesseans. Her story became a rallying cry for Jackson's populist base, who viewed the attacks as an assault on their values. Campaign songs in 1832, like "The Hunters of Kentucky," referenced poor Rachel's honor to mobilize voters, contributing to Jackson's re-election with 219 electoral votes. Her memory became a cultural touchstone, with folktales in Tennessee portraying her as a saintly figure, as collected in Tennessee Folklore, 1935. Rachel's death also influenced the social tone of Jackson's White House. Without her, formal events were limited. Only 10 major receptions were held in his first term, compared to Adams's 25 per White House records. Emily Donaldson struggled to fill the gap, with the National Journal noting in 1830 that the absence of Mrs. Jackson leaves a void in elegance. Jackson's policies, like Indian removal, reflected his hardened resolve. The 1830 Indian Removal Act, displacing 46,000 Native Americans, was partly driven by his frontier mentality, intensified by Rachel's loss, as he sought to secure lands for settlers like those who supported him. Her story is a stark reminder that smear campaigns and character assassination are not victimless crimes. They inflict deep personal wounds and can have fatal consequences. In an age of social media and instantaneous, often anonymous online attacks, the story of Rachel Jackson is more relevant than ever. It forces us to confront the moral implications of our political discourse and the human price of partisan warfare. She matters today because she is a perpetual reminder that behind the political labels and the sensational headlines are real human beings with fragile hearts and lives that can be irrevocably broken by the poison of public hate. Rachel Jackson's life was a study in contradictions. She was a woman of the frontier who found herself at the center of national politics. She was a deeply private person whose most intimate secrets became public fodder. She desired nothing more than the simple peace of her home and garden, yet she became one of the most controversial figures of her day. She won the title of First Lady, but the victory cost her her life. Her story is, above all, a human tragedy. It's the story of a woman who endured an abusive first marriage, found true and lasting love, and then had that love used as a weapon to destroy her. Her crime, in the eyes of her attackers, was not a failure of morals, but a failure to conform to the rigid, unforgiving standards of a society that had little room for error, especially from a woman. The legal and social complexities of her situation were flattened into a simple, ugly caricature for political convenience. She was a casualty of a new, more brutal form of American politics, where winning was everything, and the human cost was of little concern. Andrew Jackson went to Washington a broken man. He served 2 tumultuous terms as president, forever changing the face of American government, all while carrying the private wound of Rachel's death. He never remarried. He wore a miniature portrait of her around his neck and placed a larger one at his bedside, talking to it each night before he slept. His presidency, for all its power and controversy, was an 8-year-long act of mourning. Rachel Jackson was never mistress of the White House. Rachel never stepped into the White House, but her absence echoed louder than most presences, shaping her husband's fury and an entire era. Her story is a heartbreaking reminder that behind the great figures and epic events of history, there are intimate love stories and personal tragedies that can change the course of a nation. Rachel wanted only a quiet life, but her tragic death ensured she would never be forgotten, leaving behind a legacy not of power, but of the devastating human price that is sometimes paid for it. That's a wrap for today's video. If you enjoyed it, smash that like button, drop us a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss our new content. Thanks for watching,